Today, we are going to talk about Spring, specifically Spring Boot. We will cover what it is, why it's useful, and some of the key features I personally use. I'll give you a brief overview of how to work with it, where to apply it, and why it's valuable. So, what is Spring Boot? It's a part of the larger Spring framework for Java, mostly for Java. Spring Boot helps you quickly set up a Spring application. It handles many components for you, like logging, web services, scanning your beans, without needing complex configurations. Spring Boot comes with a lot of default settings that work for most situations, so you can get up and running fast without having to deal with XML files or bean configurations. It just works right out of the box. Now, let's take a look at how it works. As an example, we will create a simple web service, something as basic as a hello world, and see how Spring Boot makes it easy to set up and run. Let's get started. For building my project, I'll be using Maven. Of course, you can use Gradle or something else if you prefer. Everyone has their own favorite tools. Personally, I stick with Maven since I'm a bit old school. So, we have our empty pom.xml file. What's the first thing we need to do? The recommended way to set up Spring Boot is to inherit from the Spring Boot parent pom. The parent pom already includes most of the necessary configurations. While it's not required to do this way, today we are following the standard approach that works for most people. So, what we need to do now is define the parent pom. To do that, we specify our groupId, which should be org.springframework.boot. Then we set the artifactId as spring-boot-starter parent. And finally, we need to add the version. The latest version at the moment is 1.3.3.release, but you should always use the most current version available. By setting Spring Boot Starter Parent as the parent pom for our project, Spring Boot automatically brings in a lot of the dependencies we need. Many things are pre-configured for us, which makes it easier to get started without having to manually configure everything from scratch. Quick note, by default, if we stop here and proceed without any changes, Spring Boot will use Java 1.6, which is a bit outdated now. Let's update it to use Java 1.8, which at the time of this recording is the latest stable version for production use. To do this, we need to set a property. The property we will set is java.version. As I mentioned earlier, Spring Boot comes with a lot of default settings, but you can always override them as needed. And the Java version is one of them. By changing the java.version property here, Spring Boot will pick it up during startup and use the updated Java version. If in our case it's Java 1.8. Alright, we are done with the properties. Now we need to define our dependencies. And the first one we need is Spring Boot itself. For that, we will set the groupId to org.springframework.boot. A quick note, I'm typing everything manually here. IntelliJ offers a lot of shortcuts, like inserting dependencies automatically, but that might be a bit confusing to follow, so we are doing everything step by step to clearly understand what's happening and what I'm entering. Next, we will add Spring Boot by setting the artifactId to Spring Boot Starter. We don't need to specify a version here because we have already set the parent pom, which defines all the necessary versions for us. This is one of the benefits of Spring Boot. It comes with many pre-configured settings, so we can just reuse them without having to manually configure everything. As a personal preference, and also a recommended practice by Spring, I usually add 2 additional dependencies. The first one is spring-boot-devtools, a special library that helps with debugging Spring applications. We want to cover it today as it's a big topic for another lesson. The second dependency I add is spring-boot-starter-test, which is useful for testing the application. Even though we won't dive into testing today, I suggest adding this dependency now anyway. Since IntelliJ doesn't have it listed right now, we will just write it manually. Let me briefly explain what spring-boot-devtools does. As I mentioned earlier, it's a useful tool for developers, allowing us to interact with the application, test it, and see what's happening inside. One of the key features of this tool is that it uses 2 class loaders when starting a Spring application. Here's how it works. Spring loads its static classes, like those from the Spring framework itself, into one class loader, while our application's code is loaded into a separate class loader. This way, when you rebuild the application, only your classes are reloaded without having to reinitialize everything else. This makes the process much faster, which is a big advantage during development or testing. That's one of the main reasons why Spring Boot DevTools is so helpful.